Sir Cedric Rides Again by Gerrard. Sir Cedric and Lady Matilda had a daughter, Edwina the Fair, a beautiful child, but a little bit wild, and she walked with her nose in the air. She was sweet 17, and you just should have seen the tricks that she played on her folks. She caught mice in her hat, she tormented the cat, and she loved playing practical jokes. Her collection of frogs and mangy stray dogs quite frightened Matilda to fits. And among other habits was breeding pet rabbits, which chewed all her clothing to bits. When she wore a new dress, it was soon in a mess, from climbing and running through mud. Her nurse said, "Edwina, please try to keep cleaner." But this didn't do any good. She had a devoted admirer, one Hubert the Hopeless by name. He was tall, he was skinny, a bit of a ninny, but quite a nice lad all the same. He was frightened of heights and of getting in fights, and was totally useless at games. So Edwina, who thought that boys ought to like sport, used to call him some terrible names. He liked dancing for hours and pressing wildflowers, and he played a fair tune on the lute. But Edwina just scoffed and described him as soft, though she had to admit he was cute. Hubert did as she pleased, and though bullied and teased, and made to appear such a fool, he continued to love her, and wanted no other. Life is exceedingly cruel. Sir Cedric one day said they'd all go away, for they needed a change and a rest. But he inwardly sighed as he thought of the ride with his daughter Edwina the Pest. So he gathered them round, and he very soon found that they wanted to go somewhere fine. Sir C said, "I reckon Jerusalem beckons. It's somewhere around Palestine." There was rushing and fussing and bustling and packing and cancelling the milk the last day. Then the cat was put out, and they all gave a shout, for at last they were off on their way. They sailed out from Rye with the sun in the sky, and the wind blowing hearty and strong. Poor Hubert felt sick, but the journey was quick, and they landed in France before long. Having journeyed footshore for 10 weeks or more, they were fed up with seeing new places. Then one night at 9 they reached Palestine, so they camped by a handy oasis. Sir Cedric and Hubert and most of the men went hunting the very next day. Edwina was blue that she couldn't go too, so she sulked and then wandered away. She went for a ramble and started to scramble up rocks and was soon out of sight. When the guards and her mum discovered she'd gone, it gave them a terrible fright. They formed a search party, and full loud and hearty they rushed around calling her name, for they knew they'd been slack, and when Cedric came back, they were sure he'd say they were to blame. But soon her mamma, having looked near and far, found her poking at fish in a stream. Matilda was vexed, but what happened next was like a most terrible dream. For out of their hiding, fierce bandits came striding, all hairy and lacking in charm. They looked evil and rough and exceedingly tough, and would give a girl cause for alarm. They launched an attack, but the ladies fought back. They put up a valiant fight, so that many a blackguard was limping and haggard, and nursing a bruise or a bite. But the fray was unfair, and they captured our pair, and then sat and recovered their breath, till one of the men growled, "Off to the den!" The girls feared a fate worse than death. To the castle of Abdul the Heavy they went, the chief of this villainous crew. He was 17 stones of prime blubber and bones, and his wives numbered 22. At Edwina he smiled and said, You, my fair child, are about to be wife 23. Your mother can go to the kitchen below and cook something nice for my tea." But Edwina was not to be bullied. She had courage and true British grit. Despite being small, she stood very tall, full 4'6" and a bit, and cried, "Don't suppose that this sweet English rose would marry a monster like you. I'd rather be dead." And Matilda then said, "I'm declining the cooking job too." Abdul squeaked, "I'm the boss," and he grew very cross, and he jumped up and down on the spot. "It's the prisons for you, my proud haughty two. You can stay there until you both rot." Meanwhile, back from the chase, at their fair camping place, Sir Cedric was searching in vain. He became quite distraught at the sobering thought that he'd not see his ladies again. Then they came across hints of Matilda's footprints, and those of the villainous band. Lest the loved ones be harmed, they quickly rearmed, and followed the tracks through the sand. The prince led the men to a castle, but bolted and barred was the door, and the walls were so high, almost reaching the sky, at least 300 feet, if not more. Then Sir Cedric espied his fair daughter and bride at a small prison window on high. He was baffled and vexed, annoyed and perplexed, and he let out a very long sigh. Then Carpenter John had a brainwave anon, which gave them a glimmer of hope. Said he, "My saw blade could come to their aid, and Sir Cedric has plenty of rope. Perhaps one of you could cut through the bars after scaling the wall. Don't you see? It would not be too hard. Do we have a brave guard who is agile and younger than me?" They all gazed around, but uttered no sound. Even braggarts were shaking with fear, when, to their surprise, with a gleam in his eyes, Hubert shouted out, "I'll volunteer." The crowd on the ground watched Hubert spellbound as he climbed up the steep castle wall. Our hero risked death, and they all held their breath, for fear that the good lad might fall. Sir Cedric felt ill as the boy reached the sill, but swiftly he sawed the bars through. It took just one go, which just goes to show what love and devotion can do. Edwina and Lady Matilda were speechless with rapturous joy. Young Hubert leaped in with a flourish and grin, and Matilda embraced the brave boy. But Edwina just gazed. She was truly amazed. Was this really that feeble pipsqueak? He looked such a charmer dressed up in his armor. Her legs went quite wobbly and weak. He fastened our pair to the rope with great care, and lowered them down to the ground. Then he crept down himself with spider-like stealth, and returned to their midst with a bound. Oh, loud was the sound of rejoicing, as happiness spread through the band. Edwina clung fast to her hero at last, and refused to let go of his hand. Alas, Abdul heard the commotion, and summoned the men to attack. Sir Cedric the Brave cried, "Away with you, knave! You women and children, get back!" Then Abdul bounded forth with a flourish to deliver an almighty blow. But our knight jumped aside. "Take that, sir!" he cried, and stamped on the villain's big toe. Though fat and rotund, the scoundrel was stunned, and then, taking all by surprise, he stared at his toe with a face full of woe, and tears filled his small piggy eyes. His men were distraught, for really he ought to have acted with daring and dash. So in sad disarray they led him away, defeated by Cedric's panache. "Let's away," said Sir Cedric triumphant. "We'll abandon this infidel's lair. For Jerusalem city, it's wholesome and pretty. We're bound to be much safer there." The king met them on their arrival, for he'd heard about Abdul's defeat, and he wanted to hear of his enemy's fear, so our knight told their story complete. The king was amused by the saga, and he sniggered at Abdul's weak flight. But for Hubert so brave, his sword he then waved, and straightway dubbed him a knight. Thus our boy became lordly Sir Hubert, and Edwina blushed sweetly with pride. For she knew before long, amidst laughter and song, he would make her his beautiful bride. So think about Hubert the hero, and the story behind his new name. Though reluctant to fight, still a gentle lad might end up covered in glory and fame. And thus we leave Cedric triumphant, his womenfolk saved from their plight, with Abdul brought low by a pain in his toe, a lesson to all those who fight.